That's a lot.
That's a lot.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Summer of Protocols guest talk series. This series is part of an 18-week program where a cohort of 34 researchers are exploring the various aspects of protocols. You can find out more at summerofprotocols.com. Today, we're speaking with Annemarie Poorterman and Gina Belle. Our next session will be next Wednesday with Christina Dunbar-Hester. So with that, I will pass it over to Tim to introduce our guests today.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And thanks, Annemarie and Gina for joining us. You're one of the people who heard from some of our protocols and immediately reached out because it sort of sparked an interest in you. So appreciate you both doing that. To give a bit of background, so you both work as part of, I guess, this two-sided organization, CHôRA, where you have both a foundation set up and a design agency that aims to support organizations and people in basically transformations around the world that they live in. So Gina, you're the CEO of the design part of CHôRA, and Annemarie, you're one of the directors of the foundation. So yes, I learned about your project through your speaker application, and been intrigued to kind of get to understand it a bit better. So yeah, we're very glad to have you here, and please, stage is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Tim. Just check that everyone can see my screen okay? Okay, super. Yeah, 1 second. Okay. So thank you so much for responding to our speaker request. CHôRA, CHôRA is bringing a slightly different perspective to this program, but I think we're really interested in being part of this space and seeing what our participation today sparks. So as the name said on the box, we're going to talk today about protocols for social system transformation, which is really the space that CHôRA works in. So a little bit about us to get us started. So as Tim said, we're a bit of a funny group of organizations. We've got this longer term intent that we call CHôRA space. And really the way that manifests right now is through two organizations, CHôRA Foundation, which is a not-for-profit and is really a steward of a set of knowledge and intellectual assets that we leverage as part of the space. And then CHôRA Design, which is the practitioner agency that really draws on those knowledge assets to generate value out in the world. And CHôRA Space is really, and Annemarie will speak about this later on, really the emergent constellation of us plus all of our partners that are leveraging these frameworks and assets to generate social and renewal capital to transform themselves in the world. And so really the purpose of CHôRA Space, with all of these entities with their particular roles, is to, as Tim said, support social system transformation. But I think what CHôRA particularly recognises in its efforts to do that is the complexity that we're facing, and everyone's familiar with. It's almost banal to say that the world is complex these days. But really what we've done to support social system transformation in increasing conditions of complexity is to develop our own model, framework and practice to do this. And really our intent is to not deliver this in a typical consulting manner, but really think of this as a source that different organizations and systems can access. And by systems, we mean anything from an organization to a community, to a city, to a sector or a country. We're not really presuming any scale there. We really want to offer this to the world so that they can embed within themselves the knowledge and capabilities that they need to be different, to change who they are and how they are, so that they can be more resilient and adaptive over time in this complex world that we all live in. And so really the type of innovation or design that we do is at the level of the whole social system. So really working at that level there, if we use those particular words to describe more the practitioner agency. And really, we're working all over the world in all types of sectors and spaces with this. And I'm not going to go into our laundry list of cases and practices today. But really, the way I like to think of us is that we actually work globally in and between sectors. So even I can say we work in social development, financial services, climate innovation, climate impact, to name a few. Really what we end up doing is being in the in-between spaces. And really our bigger intent with the space is actually to use the social technology tools, assets and frameworks that we have to create something that's other than these sectors and places that can generate overall transformational capacity in and across these systems that currently isn't there in the ways that we work and the ways that we typically think about making change happen. So I'll start with just a little bit of a framing on how CHôRA thinks about system transformation and what we mean by that in particular, and I guess the meta protocol or framework that we use to do that. So firstly, fundamental to what we do, as I mentioned earlier, is acknowledging complexity. And the reason that matters to us is that the situation of any social or socioeconomic development, social system transformation, organizational change is complex, unpredictable, systemic, and constantly evolving. And what matters about that is not the complexity in and of itself, but the uncertainty that it creates. The uncertainty isn't a property of the world. It's not something that's out there. It's actually what you experience individually, collectively, as a society, when we need to make decisions or take actions in that complexity. And so while the experience of uncertainty is ubiquitous in that it affects everyone everywhere, more importantly to our practice and to system transformation is how it idiosyncratically affects each particular system or decision maker as they navigate their particular relationship between who they are and the context that they're in. So really what that complexity and the uncertainty it creates challenges is our capability to design, take action, invest resources, and solve complex problems. And particularly to do this in such a way that leads to genuine structural impact over time. Most system transformation efforts are more like dartboards. We set some objectives and try to hit them and then evaluate the results afterwards. And really a lot of transformation initiatives and policies, most projects and organizations are very well-meaning and have good intents and aspirations, but they're usually implemented with a predetermined sense of what they're there to achieve, or that they already have the solutions to the problem. They're not usually there to help us learn how to be different in the face of the complexity that we're surrounded by. And learning in most transformation programs typically happens in retrospect. Most of our monitoring, evaluation, learning and adaptation systems are still looking back or basing decisions on historical data and aim towards things that we already know or can partially predict. So really the measurable aspects of the complex social systems that we're inhabiting or the complex problems that we're trying to solve. So the solution that our framework and practice brings to this problem is learning. So as I said earlier, we're really interested in embedding in social systems new mechanisms to solve problems in a way that helps them self-determine, learn, adapt, and change with their context. So there's really a reflexive and generative aspect to all of our processes and protocols. And really what we're bringing in that learning mechanism is a recognition that the solutions to our most complex and pressing societal problems need to be discovered and generated. They're not just sitting there waiting for someone to invest in them. And so really what CHôRA is looking at is not how do we solve the things that are already possible and measurable, but actually how do we dance with the context and actually generate new experience and knowledge that can help us actually bring a difference to the way that we think, what we do, and ultimately how we engage together and change ourselves over time. And for us, nurturing this strategic learning capability should be the main concern of any organization or social system with a transformation intent, really creating space between that human instinct to see a problem and solve it immediately, and really saying we need to explore, discover, and really generate new meaning, possibilities, pathways to change. And so what you can see on screen, we're not going to go into this in a lot of detail today, but this is our system transformation framework, or what we were referring to for the purposes of this event as a system transformation protocol. And really what it is an end-to-end specialized strategic capability that we bring to social systems. And what's contained within this framework is a robust conceptual process layer, so a set of foundational knowledge that we bring to the space of social system transformation, then a process architecture, so a set of instruments of work that then draws down on that knowledge to enact it out in the world, and then a set of thinking, designing, learning, decision-making tools and systems that really help us do that collaboratively in systems, in organizations, in context with people. And this whole framework and its parts are all designed to work in and with complexity, to help navigate it and resolve the uncertainty that it brings to an agent or an actor over time, so that they can learn their way into change. So what you can see on screen there is our framework has 3 spaces: problem space, learning space, solution space. And we'll go into what we mean about some of those in a little bit more detail. And across those spaces, there are 12 processes or activity protocols and instruments of work that help us attend to a particular kind of decision-making or transformation concern as we progress across the framework. And so each of those 12 segments that you can see on screen is a collaborative, relational and generative process that is designed to produce an in-time value at the moment of applying it that helps the social system progress on its transformational journey as almost an integral sequence of activity. But it's also there to leverage and generate and layer knowledge over time and produce reference points that a social system carries with them throughout their transformation journey to make decisions about what's relevant and coherent and meaningful to them as they're engaging with complexity out there. So today we're just going to focus on 2 things though. So problem space and learning space. I'm going to talk a bit about what we call our portfolio stencil and our portfolio design protocol, which I believe there was a pre-read provided on that really structures activity on the left-hand side of the problem space. And then I'll hand to Annemarie after that, and she's going to talk about the dynamic portfolio management protocol that then extracts transformational value from the portfolios that I'll talk about. We constitute in that problem space to generate learning and help systems move into change over time. So starting with the problem space, I'm going to talk about one of our tools and protocols, which we call the portfolio stencil. So we think of a portfolio stencil similarly to a genome. So where a human genome contains an organization's complete set of genetic instructions, and each genome contains all of the information needed to build that organism and allow it to grow and develop over time. And we know that most genes are the same in all people, but a small number of genes are slightly different between people. And those small differences contribute to each person's unique features. And as we know, the incredible diversity of people out there in the world. And so we're trying to do a similar thing with this tool we call a portfolio stencil. So for us, a portfolio genome is a problem-based portfolio. And by portfolio, we mean a set of particular learning projects that you design for an organization. So a portfolio genome is a problem-based portfolio's complete set of instructions. So it contains all the information within it needed to have a structured conversation about a problem and design a portfolio of actions, projects, initiatives that an organization can invest in to help them grow, develop, and discover new solutions to their problems over time. So it contains within it all the aspects of a problem that are universal and the same in all contexts. But then it's also designed and has a process or protocol that allows it to recognize the differences that are unique to each context. So if we have a city stencil, for instance, and it contains within it a sense that any urban system, there are some key features of the challenges that they're facing, whether it's a Singapore or a secondary city in the Balkans or Sydney in Australia. There are some aspects of urban dynamics and flows that are universal for cities, but then they show up very particularly in any particular context there in terms of the particular cultural norms and stories and narratives and the way that the value exchanges exist there. And so we're really toggling between something that can be rapidly applied in a particular context to help organizations move in and act. So then what sits within that portfolio stencil how do we then move into and help shape those conversations with an organization or a city or a social system? So there's really three parts to it. So the first bit is what we call a social system canvas or a social system ontology. And so there's three constitutive elements in there. And this is one of the first pieces that we put together in the stencil and then take into organizations. And it's really trying to focus on the key constitutive elements that are structural to how any social system negotiates action. So one of the axes is human experience. So really saying within this problem space, whether it's, looking at tourism systems, a city, a corporate, what are the key interactions of the human agents in the system and their experience of it in and over time? What are the resources present in the system and available to it? We know that actions in human systems are a function of the resources available to them. And the vertical axis is about decision making. So observing the mechanisms that exist in that system to direct it and engage it in actions. And so really what we do at this first level is really just represent the key constitutive elements of that particular system or problem. Then we move from that canvas to areas of interest. So if we say this is our problem space, we then articulate particular almost archetypes of social system dynamics. So relevant relational dynamics, system attractors, or areas of activity that are particularly relevant to our transformation intent. So if we're working in the tourism sector and want to move towards sustainable tourism, what are the particular value flows and system dynamics that we really need to acknowledge our uncertainty about and move in and learn? And then we articulate something called positions, which is really saying, within this problem and these areas of interest, where in particular do we want to position ourselves in that problem? What particular aspect of the social fabric do we want to observe, experience, and engage with so that we can explore and discover new possibilities over time? And the way that we represent that is spatially. So 3D representations, and this is a space that we're actively exploring and experimenting with different technologies, but actually bringing that to life. So it's malleable, you can explore, move around in it, and actually think about the relationship between the parts, who you are, the context, the positions that you're taking in it, what you're learning, the value it's generating over time. But also really leveraging our brain's very powerful capability to leverage abstraction to make sense of complexity. So we're really looking at a medium level of complexity that helps us work with and in it as designers. And so then just a sense of then the steps, I guess, the protocol itself for then applying that, bringing it into a system. Because as we said, the stencil is sort of a universal assumption or an ontology that we're giving ourselves around the key features of a problem that needs to be situated in a particular system. And so this is the flow, the way that we do that. So starting with the problem space, we have a who, why, and what that's really important there. Because agency matters. If we're trying to transform ourselves or a system, we need to understand who is the agent that wants to take that transformative action. What resources do they have available to them? What is their mandate or strategy to do so? Why do they want to take action? What are the effects or impacts that they're trying to create? And what is it that they want to transform? And being really clear on that and creating a shared and socialized representation of it. So as a collaborative system, people have we create both the instructions that the stencil needs to transform it into a particular context, but also we create a reference point for those that are engaging in a transformative effort so that they can have conversations about investing resources in this effort, but also to help navigate over time and make decisions about what they're doing. So once we've created almost our portfolio theory or some terms of reference for then engaging and using that portfolio to make transformation happen, we then represent that as a learning space. And so we then say, if this agent and this context, this social system, then these are the areas of interest that need to be observed and explored and the particular qualities of them here in this particular place. And then via this particular set of learning positions that we establish here in this place, we're going to now go out there and have experiences in the world and generate learning. And so that's how we come to that 3D representation. And then once we've got a sense of the shape of the portfolio, we then design and activate a set of options, which are really relationships we form. If we've created our sort of abstract representation of the problem, options or the projects and activities we design, we then go out into the world and form actual relationships with people that then help us explore and resolve some of those uncertainties, generate new experience, knowledge, and learning over time. So this picture really just shows the anatomy of everything I've talked about. And this process establishes a first portfolio composition or an anatomy that then enables robust and coherent strategic decision-making, reflection, management, and learning over time. And so really what this does is create a systemic representation of your strategic problem that enables you to constantly reflect on the relationship between your strategy, your rationale, your portfolio theory, the space that you're moving into to learn and try to generate new solutions to your problems, and then how you then frame and reframe your understanding of yourself and that problem over time so that you can eventually generate new solutions to it. And that's what Annemarie will be talking about now, is once we've established a portfolio, a set of learning-oriented projects and initiatives, how do we work with that to generate value from it over time? So I'll pass to you now, Annemarie. She's getting her headphones to work. I'll get you to share your screen now.
Thanks, Gina. Oh.
One second.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, thanks, Josh. So let's orient ourselves. Sorry for that. I just needed to get rid of an echo. So I hope you all could take a long breath. So let's orient ourselves again to the framework that we introduced this to. We just heard about the importance of representing yourself into a problem space as a way to move into a position to start designing action from. And I will cover a bit more about how we then think about creating the conditions to learn. So the learning space is really where you generate kind of the value, the intelligence to move into your solution space. The learning space is really where any agent in a social system interact with its environment and learns on account of that. It is where portfolios become the instrument with which you explore the relationship between yourself and your context and the implications that flow from that. And these portfolios, as we just said, are composed of options. After you have formed and represented your problem space and have articulated positions from which you can learn, you start by designing a portfolio of options. And options are essentially, as Gina just explained, the conduit for engagement with a mandate. They bring a mandate to bring back experience to you. So simply said, they can be projects or activities that have a learning wrap to them. And that portfolio of options then really becomes the fuel or the source of input into how you generate and extract value from that. So here you see visualized how that portfolio of options is really a source for a constant flow of possibility. generated through the dynamic management of those portfolios and into intelligence assets that then eventually become kind of the arguments for how you induce change in the system that you work in. So for the learning space, as we just saw it represented in the framework, dynamic portfolio management is the core process, and the dynamic portfolio management protocol is really the core protocol to describe how a social system can bring this capability to itself. So dynamic management describes a capability in this learning space where you can extract value from portfolios of options. Dynamic here refers to the constant interaction you are able to have with your environment through the options in your portfolio. And management refers to how you're then able to act on the learning implications from these interactions in a way that allows you to be adaptive and continuously cohere in relationship with your context. So dynamic management has an input, a portfolio of options, a structured process to extract value from that, and a potential to use that value to make an impact in the social system you're working in. So this capability includes the structured process of making sense of and generating intelligence from a portfolio, as well as the capability to then use this learning to both make changes to that portfolio as a learning instrument, as well as eventually to your system in the form of structured arguments. Here you see represented the overview of what the dynamic portfolio management protocol looks like. And it's a structured protocol to make available to yourself that capability. It's an overarching protocol that has under it 3 nested protocols. It includes sense-making, portfolio composition, and intelligence. So sense-making is a continuous learning process where you produce learning and generate meaning from experience. It is where you bring in the option experiences from your portfolio to collectively generate what we call excites. They're really, they're really kind of the outputs of a sense-making and meaning creation process that can inform the implications and management of this learning. So yeah, just to remind us that these experiences are meant to tell us something about the relationship that you have with your context. So some of these excites can immediately be acted on because they tell you something about how well your portfolio is functioning as a learning instrument. It could be that you are learning, that the learning that you get through your portfolio gives you way too little information about one aspect of your work, or that some of your options are lacking the possibility to generate new relationships. So this, through portfolio composition, can immediately result in instructions back to your portfolio or to your options, or even travel back through the framework to the parts that Gina just explained about kind of how you might need to rethink about the way that you've formed the positions or the areas of interest that you represented as part of your problem space. But generally, excites that are generated through the sense-making process, they also sediment and layer. And ultimately, when they achieve a level of readiness and robustness, they become ready to help you create intelligence assets that form the basis of arguments. So intelligence is really like the formalized and generative outcome, sense-making in a way that allows you to directly induce change in the system you're working in. So it's created, intelligent, not discovered, and needs a certain kind of level of readiness to be taken outwards and to be structured and formalized into arguments for change. So what that change looks like depends really on the intent that you've started with. And that intent you continuously renew, but ultimately tells you something about the impact that you want to make in a system. So this could, for example, be policy change if you are an actor with an intent for social development transformation. And if you then see your portfolio as a portfolio of policy-making options, this brings back to you the capability to generate intelligence assets that can inform policy arguments. And therefore, this allows you to directly induce change into a policy environment of a particular country or context or system. So if we think about the protocol, we've just seen the overarching kind of, or the architecture of the protocol, which really had those 3 core processes and protocols underneath it: sense-making, portfolio composition, and intelligence. And there are really 3 of a series of protocols that together form kind of the transition from concept to process under our framework. And under each of these protocols are process guides. And they're a way to give access to a practice to use this framework in any organization or community or government or system, as we just described, as a set of rules and engagement that are designed to be generative wherever they engage with the system. So their process guides are where concepts translate to process and process translates to materials and tools. They are important not just because they have the information contained in them to run these processes well, but also because they allow for distributed agency across an organization to form decisions on any part of the framework. And for us, this is really where dynamic management comes down to. Dynamic management really requires distributed capability to form decisions. Because you're constantly interacting with an environment, you want as many points as possible to generate these experiences. So if through the process guides, we can almost distribute the capability to use that and engage with the context, it will dramatically increase the learning that you're able to bring back through means of your portfolio, and thereby increase the value of the learning and the intelligence you're able to create from that. This is just an overview to give you a sense of the detail these process guides go into. And maybe it's also worth saying that these come with a series of other materials, such as templates and dashboards that you can use to design and carry out activities from the protocol. And what we also hope to achieve with it, and I think it refers to Gina's point earlier, is that we don't see ourselves as a consultancy who really needs to be with people every step of the way as they use these protocols. This is a really kind of self-starting point, and they're not dependent on CHôRA being there with them. Because ultimately we're interested in structuring our engagement with the partners that we work with along very different lines than helping them in kind of the carrying out of activities under that. And hopefully, increasingly, as we develop our relationships, we much more like to see them as collaborators on the knowledge that we build from our experiences on social system transformation. And here I would also go into a bit more overview of how we think that this could ultimately help us to generate a space and a collaborative setting in which we think of protocols really as the genomes for how we work together. So what are we learning and asking ourselves about protocols? One thing that we observe is that protocols allow us to learn and evolve infinitely. What we describe as rules under protocols are really starting point to get us at a place that we can lean in and move in and learn in a system, but also provide the conditions to get started. What happens from there is a continuous layering of learning and evolution of an agent in relationship to its context. So the visual here represents that layering of learning and shows that it grows outwards, whilst there is a core, which is the intent of any agents and which remains the attractor for any learning to sediment over time. And in social systems, this intent in its most abstract and basic form is an intent for self-determination and transformation. So sharing this intent across social systems then allows for the emergence of almost a spatial arrangement where the protocol becomes the attractor for social systems to connect. And across this space, this gives way for the formation of a social contract between different players and agents and formations, where they engage in the exchange of possibility and create intelligence assets that support the self-determination. And this is where I'll end where we began, because CHôRA sees this as, has this as its intent to create this space form. And for this space form, we propose protocols generally and learning and therefore dynamic portfolio management protocols specifically as genomes for generating knowledge on system transformation, social system transformation. And as we are, as CHôRA, intending to move from one to many to many, this creates questions that we're also keen to bring in discussion with you today and maybe from here onwards. we have questions around how protocols can allow systems to have distributed budgets of possibility, and how digital technology can play a role in enabling this at scale, not just in terms of interactions and quantity, but also scale as the depth of learning that it generates. And as we're increasingly thinking of ourselves as a space form that interfaces with multiple agents, how do we embed one or more of our protocols in that so that we can start creating this space with others? And what role can learning technology play in enabling these protocols not to be deterministic, but instead become genomes for infinite development? So that's also something that we'd really love to engage more with this community on, to think about how blockchain protocols can play a role here. And also how social system theory and CHôRA's knowledge assets and design practice could be an entry into a discussion on how protocols then become sort of like the starting points or the genomes for social system transformation. Yeah, so maybe we end here and move into more of a discussion space. And yes, we're of course here also happy to answer any questions you have about the framework, or sort of like, yeah, where we want to take it from here, and just very curious to hear your reflections on how you're coming to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, so I'm reading through the Discord chat that we've had in parallel here. One question that people would have, or it would be helpful to walk through is, is there like a specific example that you can kind of walk us through where you use this process as part of an engagement, and maybe kind of, explain what were some of like the assumptions or like worldviews that the partner you work with had prior to, and like how your framework helped them reshape this or reframe this, and sort of what the like output was. Yeah, I think that'd be a really helpful place to start.
Okay, let me just grab a specific case that I can walk us through, that I think should only take about 5-10 minutes. I think that should be okay then. Let me just find it.
Yeah, I think that'd be really helpful.
Okay, so I'm gonna give, I wouldn't say it's the best example, but an example from our work in the United Nations Development Program with the UNDP Malawi country office. So I think that's the most readily available one that I have. So let me go in there, and just a caveat that this was not curated for you, so I'll have to ad-lib a little bit as I went along. So I'm not going to go back and go through the preamble around the framework, but if you'll kind of remember those three spaces there. In Malawi, so just to give you a bit of a background on the project itself, this was a collaboration between CHôRA and the UNDP Malawi country office, and to some extent the government of Malawi. And so the way that we framed the problem and the project was in the following terms. So Malawi, I think, is, if not at the bottom, but I think in the bottom 5 to 10 of the lowest economically development countries in the world. And really what the UNDP there was thinking about is how can we leverage governance, and governance as a really cross-cutting concern, orthogonal to all of the SDGs, to really help accelerate and amplify development effects in Malawi and create a stronger base for the country to grow and self-determine its own development. And so that was really the problem that we started with, then thinking about how can we better leverage our governance portfolio. So the projects that they were engaged in as the United Nations around governance and providing advice to the government, which is slightly different. And really what they worked with us to do is say, how can applying this portfolio approach and dynamically managing our portfolio in this manner really help to generate new choices and solutions and completely new models for how we think about governance, and bring it into the space of collaboration between the UN and government, and ultimately in service of the citizens of Malawi. And so really what the solution space we were looking for there, which Annemarie spoke to, was really how can we design policies and pathways to accelerate whole of system change based around this governance portfolio. So really specifically what we did in Malawi was we went through a 3-step process. So firstly, we did what Annemarie referred to, what we call portfolio sense making. So really a process where we look at their existing projects, what they're currently doing as a development organization, to think about how can we link them up, create new synergies and uncover opportunities, but also build a better shared sense of the problem and intent for that portfolio. And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail. So basically observing the current portfolio and what value it's delivering as an investment that the organization was making in system transformation in Malawi. And so it's almost a diagnostic that we did on the value being produced by the current initiatives. Then we used the intelligence that was generated by that really told us where are our gaps and opportunities in the work that we're doing. And so we leveraged, invested that intelligence in naming some new positions in the system, some new project prototypes, types of relationships that they might need to build, completely different sorts of engagements that they would need to invest in as the UNDP to actually create better system transformation effects in Malawi, but as a function of going out there and learning and actually generating some new relationships, resources and capabilities. And I'll go into a little bit of detail around functionally how we did that with them. So firstly, we applied a portfolio sense-making protocol, which I'm not going to go into in a lot of detail, but really just to give you a sense of, this is literally us sitting together in a room with people, engaging in a collaborative strategic reflection on who they are, what they're there to do, and how they're currently investing their time and care and strategic mandate in a set of activities together. So really, the sense-making process, when we say it's a social, collaborative, relational technology, we mean we literally bring it into spaces, not always physical, right? Sometimes this is a digital space or hybrid experience. And really what it does is stimulate some strategic reflection questions in this instance. So we were really saying why this particular set of activities at this point in time. Are these activities relevant and coherent to the types of problems that we're facing and the changes in our context? How coherent are the activities with our intent, what we're actually saying we're here to do as a development organization? How could these activities work better together? And how well are they not just solving the problems that we have some sense of the shape of solutions to, but how well are they actually helping us observe changes in the context and actively learn about what we don't know and generate entirely new capabilities and relationships as a development organization in this space? So functionally, this was a 2-day workshop where we brought together all the program and project managers across the space and invited them to share and reflect on the experiences that that governance portfolio was currently producing. And when we say experience, as Annemarie said, the way we think about options in CHôRA is there's projects that are happening that have objectives and outcomes that are baked into them. And really what an option is almost like a learning wrapper we put around that. So you don't just do what the project is there to achieve, but you use it as a mechanism to actually observe contextual dynamics and other things that are happening around the project. Almost use it as a stepping stone to connect into and build other relationships and resources and to observe the things you don't know about. So that's through relationships with partners, different investments that you're making. So it's really using projects as vehicles for learning as optical devices to understand the context as it evolves, as well as actually, work on delivering projects, services, initiatives in that context. So we spent 2 days extracting insights from those experiences. So actually saying, how effectively is our current portfolio helping us to contribute to system transformation? What are the gaps and opportunities? And then we followed that by another 2-day workshop where we then said, so what? And this was a combination of senior management and the senior project and program managers within the organization, really making sense of the emerging opportunities, constellation, gaps and challenges that they have to really meet that system transformation intent. And I think really recognizing that gap, that they're not actually learning how to generate new solutions. They're really really doing very standard things that are looking to solve those problems in ways that are based on very historical information and mechanisms for thinking about doing socioeconomic development. And so engaging in this activity actually gave them an entirely renewed sense of orientation as an organization, and surfaced completely new ways, even from this first engagement, that they could move forward, engage with the government and be in the space around them. So then just going back to both the portfolio stencil and as a protocol, functionally what we did was, on the left-hand side, with Malawi, represent governance as a problem space as observed by the UNDP and the government. And so what you can see there is we've really said, well, if we create an abstract representation of this as a problem, what is the ontology of this problem, the key constitutive elements of it? And so we said governance as a problem space in Malawi. The main things that make up the space of social dynamics that the development agency is interested in is policy implementation, social inclusion, and citizen participation. So really then acknowledging almost on the horizontal, the way that collaboration happens across the system between government and citizens, and then sort of the accountability that's created through different participation mechanisms as well. So this is just really trying to give shape to, for the UNDP, what are the key elements of the problem that we need to observe, but then also acknowledging that governance and anything that you do to try and affect governance systems or use governance as a tool is nested. And so we're really just noting that things like climate change, poverty, youth, women empowerment, of course, governance is addressing those problems, but you can also think of them as separate or nested problem spaces in and of themselves that the UNDP is observing. So that's sort of how we created and applied the stencil here. And then what you can see on the right is we then situated or positioned their existing work in that space. So that's the first place where this representation becomes really useful, because they can immediately see, almost as a heat map, where are we currently positioned, not out in the world geographically, but in our problem. What aspects of our problem are we investing in, learning about and acting on right now? And as you can see from this, most of it was focused on social inclusion, with a few things, right down at the national level. And really working more at the very low level of kind of one directional engagement with citizens. So even just mapping things out like this just showed that there was a massive gap in terms of actually working on policy implementation and citizen participation in a really robust and diverse way. And so this is where we're applying portfolio theory, not as it applies to sort of financial portfolios and trying to get a return on investment in those ways, but actually saying how are we ensuring that we're getting a return on investment in terms of renewal capital or social transformation capital here. And so this was just a first way of then them recognizing where are we currently and where else do we need to go. And this is where you start dynamically managing. You've got a first portfolio composition and you say, well, this isn't sufficient. The quality of our portfolio is really not going to produce the sorts of outcomes and effects that we need to. And so then in engaging in that process of designing new options, new places to go, you can see in the bottom right, we actually just mapped out as a first activity, where else do we need to position ourselves? What aspects of this problem does the UNDP and the government actually not currently have a good understanding of how they can move in there and take action? And so there they actually avoid, you take action where your resources and capability can be effective. And so this was actually acknowledging, and having the hubris to say, well, actually, some of the ways we need to solve this problem, we know we don't know. And so this was them actually acknowledging for themselves what some of those spaces they wanted to move into were. And then through that dynamic management process that Annemarie talked about, so, establishing a portfolio, extracting and layering learning over time from it, generating intelligence, and then thinking of the portfolio as an ongoing act of making and design, we then created a new integrated portfolio that had an entirely new theory for how those things would work together to generate learning and actually establish a whole new set of relationships and partnerships, but in and between the government and UNDP Malawi, but more broadly across the system in general. And then just one last comment on this, because I don't want to run out of time. This representation, you know, Annemarie talked about sort of dashboard systems and tools. These aren't these aren't sort of inert objects. We don't just make them for the fun of it. They're actually representations that get leveraged throughout the whole life cycle of the portfolio and the program. So each portfolio manager and each of those squares represents, you know, humans engaging in activities and trying to learn and solve these problems together. So this becomes a tool that actually helps people jointly and severally actually hold themselves accountable to ongoing coherence and relevance of the portfolio. So it helps, you know, the leaders of the UNDP country office observe how well they've invested and deployed themselves, not in responding to crises in the context, but actually to learning and getting ahead and observing system dynamics. It helps project managers understand what they're doing relative to other things in the portfolio. And by very virtue of having this as a representation, it makes emergent exchanges and value dynamics between the things in the portfolio and the people managing them possible. So then we've got this new portfolio, and then we supported Malawi for a year to then dynamically manage that, to generate learning, to generate new renewal capital for themselves. So you can see this happened at 3 levels. So we started by looking just within the UNDP and saying, what are we learning from our own initiatives that are purely managed by the UNDP, and really focused to start with on, is the way that they've structured their own portfolio internally effective in generating new intelligence to solve development problems. And so this is really looking at, you know, typical UN offices. They have sort of, you know, their version of silos, sort of thematic clusters or areas that they typically bundle projects into, but there's no communication and information flows between them. So that was the first level of intelligence that they brought to themselves, was actually making their own activities more learning oriented and opening up more strategic choices for them as an organization. We then build on this by taking a sector level. And this is where by dynamic management, we actually mean taking, you know, not just perspectives on your own portfolio, but different, actually bringing in different collaborators from across whatever your network of social system looks like there. So here we then took a sector level view and brought together a whole bunch of government agents, people from other development institutions and development partners together to actually observe their combined efforts around governance, to actually collectively extract insights and excites, as Annemarie said, explore and learn about the synergies between their organizations and domains. And that intelligence gets invested back into their individual portfolios, and also creates this interesting coherence and shared exploration orientation across the different players in Malawi, where they can know that they're both, you know, literally putting out fires and responding to crises, but actually together taking a much broader, longer term and contextual perspective on how together they might contribute to development effects. And then the final one was a national perspective. So this is where we really went to the level of policy and government, and really saying, you know, if we go from UNDP to sort of development institutions and agencies in the system, how do we now connect that really directly into government? Particularly because UN agencies are in countries on the invitation of the government. And so they're really there to support whatever the current government's mandate is. So really trying to explore, how can you bring this sort of learning oriented protocol and disposition into that space of exchange and interaction between development agencies and the government. And so in this session, we really took the government's mandate, particularly their broader digitalization, country digitalization and governance agenda, and the Malawi 2063 vision. And we really said, if we put this and what the UNDP and other development agencies are all doing together and observe them in that problem space, what does it tell us about our current intent, ambition, and how coherent what we're all doing and investing in together is towards bringing about the sort of transformation that we want in the country? And so this work actually had some immediate effects. So if this is over a year, I'll just give you a sense of some of the outcomes that came out of that in terms of, as Annemarie said, some of the learning that you're generating, you invest back in the portfolio. to give you that learning orientation and that discovery mechanism to find new solutions to problems over time. And then you get to points where there's a robustness or a sense of, make a qualitative judgment that we've actually got a sense of an entirely new model or way of doing things that we can now invest in, more structurally changing things. And so this work actually ended up seeding a few different things. It established a previously unthought of futures and foresight function within the government, which doesn't sound very avant-garde to people like us. But in a country like Malawi, the idea that the government should have a futures and foresight orientation as a strategic part of their system was a very big thing. But also it produced a portfolio proposition that actually brought together governance and digital transformation as a mutually reinforcing integral space that could both be implemented to create new immediate infrastructure in Malawi, but could actually create a learning orientation at a country level in terms of observing the new value dynamics that happen as a reinforcing loop between, digital transformation and governance. As you digitally transform, it makes different governance mechanisms possible, and your governance mechanisms, both constrain and enable digitization. And that's just a very gross simplification of it. But yeah, so that's a very quick walkthrough of a 1 to 2 year project. But I think it starts to show you how, this started within an organization with us and then broadly attracts and brings in different players across the whole country and ecosystem to then use that protocol as a shared language that helps them all jointly and severally work together around this space.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that was a really helpful example. One question that just came up in the chat is whether like Malawi was able to use the outputs of this to solicit funds and kind of raise money. Do you know any, do you have a view in after your engagement was finished? If they were able to take this and bring it to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say that's, there's a whole bunch of values that having a portfolio like this creates, because it is creating an entirely new investment mechanism as well, on account of a couple of things. So firstly, just articulating a very clear transformation intent. It sounds like something obvious, but it's not actually really present there, particularly in development, for instance. You've got all the SDGs and it's really hard to really put your finger on what are we really channeling our resources to right now. So actually that portfolio theory and intent becomes a really interesting attractor from funders and donors and different agencies, but also unlocks within the country capital and different financing mechanisms from local players and other adjacent players, by very virtue of representing the portfolio in that form, because they can literally see it and say, actually, I'm doing something in that space. So I think, it becomes a new investing mechanism, collaboration mechanism. That's how you can see how the space emerges from it, as Annemarie was talking about. And it creates a lot of possibilities beyond the learning mechanism that it produces.
Got it. Thanks. I have one last question, if you can stay on for a couple minutes. So I think throughout the presentation, one thing that's been at least that I've noticed is you have a very deliberate use around language, right? For your entire framework, you've clearly spent tons of time thinking about how to structure this and how to frame this. And I'm curious if you might want to talk about what's your inspiration for this? Obviously, there's tons of business frameworks, social impact frameworks. There's, tons and tons of literature around this. So what's your process of looking at everything that exists, coming up with a language that you feel is accurate for, the thing you're trying to do, and at the same time, approachable to people and your sort of design thinking around the language that you use for all this. The question.
No, it's a very excellent question, because I think one of the biggest challenges we get is being called overly intellectual sometimes. But I think sometimes that's deliberate. So I think I'll get to your answer. But with language, I think for us, language and knowledge shapes worlds, or your possibility to imagine new worlds. And so there's a few things there. Really sometimes we're bringing words as irritants actually to force people to have to think differently than they currently are. So there's a piece there just around almost planting brainworms that you can't let go of. But of course, there's an aspect to our work that to change, you need to be uncomfortable. And we often use language as a tool both to give just enough structure that you can be in that space, but also to remind you that you're trying to do something different if you want to engage with CHôRA in social system transformation in this manner. But also the reason we're deliberate about language as well is that it really creates these anchor points that follow you through what could be a 5-year program of work. So we try to use very particular terminology that almost builds and connects and creates a reference system that even if you're in year 2, you can almost remember, intent on day 1, now combines with intent plus impact plus something else later on. So there's a very sophisticated almost language reference system there. Then to specifically answer where we draw the language from. So we are, as you can imagine, very multidisciplinary in the work that we do, but there's certainly some particular foundational knowledge sources that we draw on as a basis for this. So certainly, complexity and social system theory, obviously, are really playing out in there. Strategy is a really important one. And I think for us, some particular articulations of strategy as coherence in the design of action in the world. A lot around sort of second order cybernetics and hermeneutics, actually. It's actually quite, but all of these things, whether it's complexity, social systems theory, strategy, and of course, design and innovation more as a cross-cutting piece, we're interested in the aspects of those theories and practice that are really about human social systems and how they form meaning and understand themselves and therefore exist and change in the world. But they are some of the foundational sources, if I was going to call out some of the pillars that sit behind this. And so I'd say we're probably not completely, there are some foundational assumptions to our work. I wouldn't say that we're neutral in our worldview in terms of how we think social systems can best attend to complexity. But I would say we are agnostic in terms of how systems should change. We don't want to tell systems what they should change into. We think we have a good how that can help them do that. And I think that's something really important about our work, and also a difference between a CHôRA space and a consulting firm. We're not there to give answers to people, and that's why we're interested in this protocol space, but actually create a sequence of thinking and doing that makes change a greater possibility in really complex conditions. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
No, thanks. That was actually very, very good context. So I know we're already a bit over time. I don't know if anyone else on the call has closing questions. Otherwise, we can wrap up. But if you have a question, now's your chance. Oh, Dorian?
Yeah, I'm curious to know how these resources are reified, like the visualizations and whatnot. Are they just a picture? Are they interactive? Do they live on a website? Do they live on an extranet? Do they how do they exist?
I would say two things. It depends on the client that we're working with and their base capability and technological kind of infrastructure right now. So that's sort of more in the, as Annemarie said, we are working more in a one-to-one with organizations right now functionally. But with respect to that broader space of, research and exploration that we're engaged in, we're really experimenting right now with how we can make this as dynamic and spatial as possible. And so, things like the 3D space that I showed you, that's actually like a proper three-dimensional model that you can, interact with to some extent. But, that's probably disconnected from our reporting systems which might be in there. So we've got almost a lot of different types of technologies that we're using, some of which are quite lo-fi, like Notion plus Miro plus something else, and others which we're experimenting more with, emerging technologies and how they play around there. So I'd say there's a bigger use case we're building for ourselves to answer your exact question. How best can we hold and carry and represent these sorts of things so that they can have an over time quality that actually enable distributed engagement in time? as well. So a mix, but I'd say that's the space where we're kind of exploring and investing ourselves right now. It primarily 2D probably up until about 2 years ago, and we're really moving more into 3D spatial at the moment.
I guess I mean I find it's the time dimension that you kind of have to worry about when you're making representational artifacts like this, because they
Absolutely
minted, they get put into a spiral bound book or something like that, and that goes in a drawer, and then you pull it out a year later, and is it relevant? Is it the same as it was when it was put in there? Like, that seems to me to be like the challenge for this kind of a thing, is they just don't stay up to date. I just in my experience making these kinds of things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just one more comment on that. How would I put it? I would say no representations we make are arbitrary to the rest of the process. So I think just to point out, it's almost like anything that we produce at any one of those steps, it has a utility in future steps. And I mean like an active, collaborative, generative utility. And so of course there are kind of broader project and other sorts of things there, but your exact question and concern is one that I'd say is a primary thing that we bring to representation in general, because I'd say that's one of the problems with strategies. Going back to the beginning of my conversation, is that they're not real and lived and enacted. They're just, a bit of paper that someone writes on that goes somewhere. So everything we represent, whether it's textual, spatial, 2D, etc., it's there to be something that you carry with you throughout this journey, so that we can all know what are we working with reference to, making decisions with reference to, designing with reference to throughout. But nonetheless, that's a challenge, because humans also want to just put things in drawers and not think about them at some point.
And maybe I would just add to that, is that I think we're also thinking about the representation part of the problem space as a moment where it's a design tool, right? It's a heuristic. It allows you to move in. And then the portfolio really becomes the dynamic mechanism through which you continuously learn. So I don't think we're saying that the representation part should really hold over time. It then really becomes, like to Gina's point, like it's part of a process in which you move into a situation in which you're continuously bringing back experiences for yourself that actually allow you to update that on a time by time moment. So I think we're seeing representation really as a design tool to be able to move in and to be able to tell yourself, like, this is the most kind of the most feasible abstract representation that we can give ourselves to be able to design actions from, but it's not supposed to kind of like hold throughout the whole process. That's then where you bring other kind of instruments.
Have you considered a computable representation?
Need to clarify for me what that is.
Well, I mean, it's like, whereas you have a representation that is like a picture and it is something that a human process would undertake, but there's one could imagine a complementary thing where it's got the same sort of topological structure and it can be
yeah, no, I take your meaning. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think more just as a bit of a list, we're setting up this year and have been doing a few small experiments across a whole range of different digital and other technologies, from like multi-agent systems and AI to different 3D modeling softwares to, blockchain, all those sorts of things. And I think what we are really thinking about, to your question, is what can be automated or sort of like dynamic and live somewhere, what needs to have some kind of what's ephemeral versus needs to carry over time as well. And also, one of our primary questions is, right now, this is a very human, knowledge worker dependent activity. And a lot of our technological questions are about, how do humans and technologies help each other and work together across the whole spectrum of this space, both representationally, but in terms of, that carrying and layering of the sorts of learning and insights over time, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's almost, like 20 different specific use cases which aren't unique in and of themselves in the questions that we're asking. But I think there's something unique in almost how we want to loosely couple those into a particular type of social transformation system. And that's where, CHôRA doesn't have within it almost even the technological capability to even know what the right questions to ask and answer are, which is why we get really excited, meaning, systems like this, where we can almost say, what sits in between? Like, what are some threads where we could weave together some of the things that we're asking, either at the kind of point use case level or, as an overall exploration of how do you enable a space of hundreds of organizations doing this using a single shared protocol, for instance?
Amazing. Thank you so much, Annemarie and Gina, for your time today. And yeah, so we will see you all on June 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a chat with Christina Dunbar Hester. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.